Or if you think like on your house plant, you can detect, or it's too cold, so it's starting to wither. I need to move it away from the cold window. That's adaptive management. That's kind of the same, right? You need to understand what it is it needs. And if your way to tell if you're having an impact is something dies, that is not a good thing.
Welcome to the Owners of Deep Sea Mining podcast. Kaja Lønn Fjærtoft, Chief Global Policy Lead for WWF Deep Sea Mining. Some combination of those words.
And then also the Senior Ocean Policy Officer in the Norway office.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, so you do Norway policy, ocean broadly, and then global policy deep sea mining, more specifically.
Oh, I feel like already I'm like a bureaucratic. Okay. So I'm 50% of my job is to be the global policy lead for deep sea mining for WWF International, across our 100 offices.
Mm-hmm.
And then 50% of my role is basically leading everything on deep sea mining in Norway. So that includes actually more than policy, and includes like finance, business, like coordinating and making sure all of that.
Yeah, cool. What we're going to talk about today is both Norwegian and international deep sea mining policy, but I think we're going to focus mostly on Norwegian and going to get myself and the listeners caught up on what's been happening in Norway and why.
Yeah.
Let's start with you. Who are you and how did you end up to have jobs both at the WWF?
So I'm a marine biologist by training. Actually, a marine biology with marine technology specialization.
Yeah. What does that mean?
Yeah. From here in Trondheim, they have a master's called Marine Coastal Development.
Mm-hmm.
When I was going here, where basically half of your master's is engineering and half of it is biology, which basically means that I had one supervisor who was a marine biologist, who helped me with the biological part, and one supervisor from marine technology. So I did like robotics with deep sea.
Yeah, cool.
So I was really, after I finished my undergraduate or bachelor's or whatever you call it, in Australia, which was much broader in like zoology and ecology, so like rainforest and ocean and everything that's living basically, I wanted to focus in on deep sea and I wanted to be a bit more like technical, like robotics and everything.
You did your master's in marine biology and technology here at NTNU in Trondheim.
Yes.
Which is kind of super appropriate for deep sea mining then, because it's the combination of both these things. So if you can keep up with the technology conversation also then.
And then I have a mum, a dad, and a stepdad that are all marine geologists from the oil and gas industry.
Oh, incredible.
And my dad introduced me to the topic of deep sea mining when I was 15. And I followed it since I did my undergrad in 2012, because this is when the Papua New Guinea project was kind of kicking around and I was living in Australia. So I've followed this topic for over 12 years now. I think it gives me an interesting perspective because I can understand the technology side, I can understand the biology side, but also geology, partly because I did some stuff in geology in my undergrad, but also partly because I think I've been giving like continuous geology lessons from my father since I was barely able to walk. Also have been able to have a lot of conversations in a very open and frank manner about deep sea mining and I think where we both have learned something different and probably came from different perspectives in the beginning.
Yeah, I could imagine that. Do you and your dad disagree on?
Now we actually agree.
Okay.
Which means he's come to my side. So I think we both share this like interest of exploration and learning, like scientific curiosity. And I think on deep sea mining, this is like a curious new frontier. And he also spent a lot of his career, so did my mom in the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate, now the Norwegian Offshore Directorate. I actually went to kindergarten there. And I think that kind of interest and curiosity to drive something forward and learn about something new, his interest came in. And I think he saw it also as an interesting possibility and maybe a solution to problems. And then I think he just did not think about the environmental side. And he did not know much about the environmental side.
Mm-hmm.
Like I did not know so much about the geology side. And then I think through our conversations and learning more about how vulnerable that environment is and how little we know and how slow things are, it's been kind of a mutual co-education from both of us. But where I think he sees now that there's actually a lot of issues and concerns that even though it's very technologically interesting, you can still, explore and understand that environment, but that it's premature to make it like a decision and understand the impact of what potentially deep sea mining could do. And that understanding, I think we do share now.
I mean, that's awesome that you got somebody that you can talk very easily with on the other side of the issue. I feel like, this is a little bit the reason that I'm trying to do this podcast and why I find this topic interesting. And especially, as you pointed out, in Norway, it's such a small community. And
it is.
you would think everyone would talk to each other and understand each other. really well.
Mm.
But I have found that that's not always the case, that people still misunderstand each other, even in the Norwegian situation. So I just feel like it must be a benefit to you to have been able to talk to somebody who pushed from the other direction.
And to be fair, like, I've made it a point since I started. So I started in the WWF 4 years ago now.
Okay.
But before that, I was in the Environment Agency and more on like a technical, like I was working with petroleum applications and like really assessing impact assessments and like very nerdy stuff. I was really into geographic information systems and maps, which is like, I love maps. I think they're super cool. It's super cool what GIS can do. And I never imagined that I would be like an NGO person, if that made sense. I did not consider myself a policy person. I was like a technical expert was my comfort zone. And I've made it a point since I started to talk to everyone. I would say I know everyone that works in this topic. Yeah. Maybe not everyone, but that's like, there's not many that I have not spoken to. And I've made it a point to continue to have an open conversation. But I think it is important to say that even though you have an open conversation, it does not necessarily mean that you will agree. Yeah. And that should be okay to have a dialogue and hear each other's perspectives. But it must also be okay that the aim of the conversation is not always that you will share the same perspective in the end. But I do think, especially in the society and the environment we live in now, where I think also media makes things like very dramatic and they want it to be like very polarized often. For me, it's very important to be able to have dialogues with everyone in Norway. So that's been my goal since I started.
Yeah, nice. And then it seems to me like it would also be advantageous to come into the policy space having had experience in some of the more practical details, and especially if you're in the environmental directorate, reviewing gritty applications for offshore oil development, then you would kind of have some idea of what the details are that you need to keep in mind before you go and have a conversation about the big picture policy details.
Yeah, and I think also when you hear industry actors, what I very often hear from the opposing side, if you should say that, or from someone with a view that deep sea mining can be managed in a way at this point, is, we'll just do adaptive management. Like we'll start, and then if there's a bigger impact, we will manage that. We will mitigate that. We will put in place some kind of things on our technology, either reducing the plume or doing some kind of technological solutions that minimizes that impact. And I think with my experience, having looked at oil and gas and having managed those applications and knowing, what does it take from very detailed stuff like the Pollution Control Act, like what kind of knowledge do you really need to be able to say, oh, we can detect an impact now, we need to put in a mitigation measure. I feel like there is a huge lack of understanding in the deep sea if you don't know if it's an octopus or a coral or a fish or a microorganism that you are supposed to mitigate the effect of and detect it. You need to understand things such as the lifespan of that organism, the reproductive cycle of that organism, how many of that organism exists, how many individuals, are these individuals the same species, or are they actually many different species that look slightly the same? And when you get into biology, you realize, like, I spent 6 months identifying deep sea parasites out of the coast of New Zealand.
Fun.
Very fun. It sounds very nerdy. It was a lot of microscope time, but I identified 3 new species together with my lab partner. And I can tell you, if I put these 3 new species in front of you, you would think it was the same blob. Like you would not have any idea that those were 3 species. You would not know they have different reproductive cycles. Like you would not know that. And unless you have that sort of detail, it is impossible to detect whether or not you're having an impact. You can really just detect if something died. While in petroleum, for instance, they have, for instance, when it comes to impacts from drilling on corals, which is one of the things that I think is talked about the most, and especially on one of the particular coral types, like the white one in Norway, Desmophyllum, they have done like lab experiments where they put more and more of the drilling material into the water, and they can detect when that coral starts to degrade in health. And that's how they know where they put the threshold, right? But that's because they know that coral, they know the life cycle, they've described it, they understand the species. And that's just one example, right, of a lot of the different species. And I think that's where, in the conversation around deep sea mining, managing it, making regulations, making thresholds, making standards, that's the kind of baseline data you need. And you need that baseline data at a broader scale than just for the area where you're going to do the project. Because otherwise you don't know if what you're describing in that area is unique there, like that fish or that coral, or if you find it like, I don't know, like all over the place.
So are you saying that adaptive management is all well and good, but you just need founded on a huge amount of background information and understanding. And to say that we're going to do adaptive management as if we're going to learn things as we go and make decisions in real time isn't so possible, because the decisions that we need to make in real time need to be researched for years beforehand.
So I guess I'm saying, if you try to take it on land, and I find sometimes it's much easier for people to think about some nature on land, because nature at sea is like, oh, a lot of times when people talk about nature, they don't even think that nature lives in the ocean, even though most of our nature is in the ocean. But if you think on land then, or if you think like on your house plant, maybe some of you have houseplants. I have managed to kill all of mine. I'm like a terrible biologist. But you can start to see when your houseplant becomes sad. Either because you did not water it enough, or it did not get any nutrients, or maybe the sun was beaming on it too hard and it gets brown. Not really a problem in Norway at this time of year, but you can detect, or it's too cold, so it's starting to wither. So you're able to see, okay, this plant is not happy now. So I need to do some kind of management. I need to move it away from the cold window, or I need to give it more water, or whatever it needs. That's adaptive management that would work, because you know that plant, you understand its life cycle, you see how it's reacting. That's kind of the same, right? You need to understand what it is it needs. And if your only way to tell if you're having an impact is that something dies, that is not a good thing, especially if you don't know if that is a unique thing. So I guess what I am saying is you need a huge amount of understanding of the deep sea environment, which does not just mean describing a species. Like, this is the new name of the species, but you need to understand that species. And you need to also understand, in, for instance, the area you are. One thing is the species that are just stuck there. But there's a lot of stuff that moves around. If you go into a forest in winter, summer, spring, or fall, if you live in a place with 4 seasons, it's very different what you encounter there. So you need to understand also the seasons of the deep sea. This may not be the same everywhere. But for instance, they have found areas where there's thousands of octopus that gather. Do they gather there once a year?
Yeah.
Is that every 7 years? Is that every 5 years? What is it that draws them there? Like, all of these questions are questions that we have. And then, we cannot know every single detail about everything. That I also acknowledge, because then we will never decide on anything on this planet, because, there's always more to learn.
Right.
But our baseline knowledge of the deep sea now is so small. And the little one we do have says that the species there are much longer lived and much slower, and they tolerate change much less, because the deep sea is more of a stable environment, because there isn't like a lot of waves, for instance, and sunlight. And so they're more susceptible to maybe getting damaged from rapid change, which, for instance, deep sea mining would introduce.
What about the other side of adaptive management in the policy context? So you're talking so far about, in order to be able to make an adaptive decision, we need to have the knowledge in order to kind of know what decision we want to make based on the feedback we're getting in real time. And in order to make a decision based on that feedback, we need to have a whole bunch of baseline foundational understanding. But then there's also the question of like, how possible is it to actually make a change once you make a decision on what kind of change to make? And that's a policy question. That's a bureaucracy question. That's is the regulatory framework going to be flexible enough to actually change as we learn things? If we all acknowledge that, okay, we'd like to do this stepwise and develop as we learn, is that easy to do?
I think that depends strongly on the regulatory framework. It also depends strongly on the regulator and who is enforcing that framework. So that's a difficult question to blanket answer, I guess, on behalf of planet Earth, which has a lot of different countries with a lot of different regulations. I do think that WWF, our goal is that we live on a planet where people live in harmony with nature. Like, that's our vested interest, that we have a livable planet for all of us, where you have the much word used sustainability, which really can mean so many things. But for us would mean that, there's the environmental aspect, there's also the climate aspect, but there's also the social aspect that needs to be integrated, right? So people is a part of it. You don't look at nature as separate, which I think is important to also take. My point is that I guess when I put my technology hat on, I can understand how people are thinking from a tech side when they say, we'll just go and test it. Yeah. And if it doesn't work, we bring it back. We change that screw, or we, oil it a bit more here. We do this and that. Yeah. And then we try again, right? Because this is how technology develops. But for biology, doing that can make a species go extinct potentially. So the risk picture there, if you look at also other things like the precautionary principle, which is enshrined in many, many laws, or the global biodiversity framework that countries have agreed to now, through the Convention on Biological Diversity, or even the United Nations Law of the Sea, which talks about effective protection of the marine environment or preventing harmful effects to the marine environment, that is the threshold, actually. That's what your job is to do, is to prevent that. So then you cannot go and harm it to try to figure out if you harmed it. Like, that's not aligned with the precautionary principle. So then I guess you would have to start with, we don't have enough knowledge, so we need to gather that information, and then we can assess whether or not there is something like a yes or no to this.
Right.
And right now, that is not the path that we are seeing being taken by many on deep sea mining, where actually they are maybe taking the environmental advice or the researchers, very clear statements that were like 10 to 15 years, if you talk about the international area, from having enough science to be able to make an assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Not all the science about everything in the world, like not mapping out every single species, but enough to be able to make a decision that's sound, that's like able to make this effective management of the marine environment. So for us, that's kind of the guiding star then. Okay, independent science, like in a big peer-reviewed paper, is saying that. Then we need to listen to that before those decisions are made. And making those prematurely is not aligned with the commitments that I guess in the international seabed context that states have actually said that they will follow.
Let's talk about what WWF is and does and why. So first of all, is just NGO like the right category description for WWF?
Yeah, so we're actually an E-NGO. And when you get into the space of global policy, you learn that there are so many acronyms. I still learn new acronyms on a weekly basis, but we're an environmental non-governmental organization. And we're one of the biggest ones on the planet, actually. So we are 6,000 people approximately, spread across 100 offices all over the planet. Including also like our the network that we call it, which I think sounds very fancy, which is kind of the overarching umbrella that coordinates across all of those offices. For instance, on policies like on deep sea mining or on oil and gas or on nature or wildlife crime. So we work on a huge amount of issues. Like I could not even name all of those issues. Mm-hmm. It's too many. And then each of those offices, it's kind of like a franchise. So each office is also WWF, but it's like WWF Norway. Yeah. So they're a separate entity. But of course, that adhere to all of the other global policy. But WWF Norway kind of stand free to pick the topics that they choose to work on. That's important in the region they are located. Or WWF, I don't know, Cameroon, or WWF China, or WWF Indonesia. Yeah.
So, I mean, one of the problems I have with non-governmental organization is it's not a very descriptive term. It tells you that you're an organization that isn't a government. And I think that a lot of organizations fit into that category.
So we're also a not-for-profit.
Right.
Yeah. So that's important, I think.
And I guess, I mean, if you take away profit-driven and kind of governmental, then what you are left with is an organization that has some sort of the driving principle of the organization is an idea or a goal or something.
Yeah, it's values. So our steering value or our steering goal, which is very broad, I acknowledge that, but a planet where humans live in harmony with nature. Yeah. And then I think what WWF does, like what our niche is we're very policy driven and we're very science driven. Okay. We also do quite a lot of projects, like for instance, plastics. We have a lot of projects like specific conservation projects on the ground in different areas. And we are, I don't know, some would call us a softer NGO. We speak to many, we are present in many countries and have offices in many countries and are very often able to have conversations or, like our international CEO is in Davos, for instance. So we are in most of the global fora and our focus is nature and climate, really, and sit in a lot of experts' bodies with expertise. And we're science driven. So we are, like, all of our policy and everything is based on sound scientific evidence. And some of our offices even have a science unit that does its own research. Mm-hmm. Some of them have vessels that do their own mapping on oceans. On land, we do a lot of research projects. So, there's a lot of knowledge and know-how. So I also feel very privileged. I have colleagues that have worked in this space for 20, 30, 40 years that I can call. But also when we talk for an issue, for instance, like deep sea mining, we also have a raw materials team and a mining team on land. And we have offices in a lot of the countries where mining also happens. And we have a circular economy team. We have teams and experts within such a wide range of topics that I really am able to draw on when we are, for instance, making a policy. And we do not make policies that are specific to one country. We make policies that are systemic change drivers. So to get somewhere. And then we also do a lot of partnerships. So one of the things that WWF really recognizes is you cannot do things alone. So our slogan is together possible. Also with industry, for instance.
Yeah.
So we collaborate also closely with a lot of industry actors.
Okay, cool. So that I think is helpful for people who don't pay so much attention to the different NGO organizations. I think that a lot of people kind of would imagine that WWF does a lot of advocacy, not because they have experience with WWF, just because this is where you often encounter NGOs is in protests. And so I think it's valuable to hear that you guys are really big. You do a lot of things.
Yeah, and I think it depends on where you are from on the planet, right? So in a lot of places where we have offices, they maybe know us for being the organization that helps local conservation organizations organize a beach cleanup or put together recycling bins for plastic or have a restoration projects in mangroves, So it depends on where you are on the planet a bit, how you know WWF. Because also in different countries, we are active in different ways. So in Norway, for instance, we don't do what we call conservation projects on the ground. While, for instance, in Kenya or Tanzania, we do quite a few of those.
Where does WWF get funded? And I'm sure you have heard WWF is just in this to protect mining interests, or that they're funded by Apple and Apple doesn't want a cheaper source of cobalt because they're vertically integrated or something.
There is always a lot of rumors about WWF. We do not have a conflict of interest. And the deep sea mining work is not funded by any type of mining companies or mining associated companies or private industry. We get our funding in a multitude of different ways. So maybe one of the things that's important, which also is different from many other NGOs, is we're not a membership-based organization. So WWF does not have members in the same way, for instance, that Friends of the Earth often has, right? Where they have more like a membership base of people. You can be like a member, and then you have a voting right. And we're organized within this franchise. Each office does different ways of fundraising. But we can have private partnerships on specific projects. So this is a possibility. In the Norway office, we don't have, I think now, any of those. We have funders from different types of foundations where you kind of apply for money and then you get money to do work. So private, basically rich people that have funding or foundational money that they want to contribute in to a certain cause. And then we also receive private donors, basically, regular people that donate a set amount of money. And then we also...
the same way I could subscribe to the Red Cross. I could subscribe to paying...
You can be like an ocean protector, maybe, fadder, I don't know what this word is. And I'm not working in our fundraising team, so I don't have all the details of how everything is, but we are an organization of transparency. When it comes to the deep sea mining work, I do know no money coming from a private sector. And our policy is purely funded and founded in science. We started going to the ISA in 2007. I don't know how to say this politely, but I would say that those accusations are not correct.
There seems to be a lot of emotions sometimes in the deep sea mining conversation, and there's sort of can be like a defensiveness. People are working at what they think is a positive technological solution to the mineral shortage, to green energy transition technologies, and then someone is pushing back and they feel like, oh, that person must have, I'm doing this for a good reason. So if I'm getting pushback, it must be for a bad reason.
Yeah.
And I find it not very hard to draw the lines that the pushback to deep sea mining comes from people's just very real concern for doing something new and doing it in an irresponsible way.
Yeah, and for us, I guess also extraction is not a new concept, right? It's a new area that people want to go do an extractive activity in. Mining is not new. Mining has terrible impacts on land, which I also think it's important to note that WWF does not just work on deep sea mining. We also work on land-based mining, where there is a lot of issues that we continuously also point out and raise in a number of our work. It's just not the deep sea mining initiative that works on that. Mm-hmm. It's the mining initiative. We obviously also work a lot with nature on land, but we look at every issue from this triple planetary crisis, right? So we look at climate, we look at nature, and we look at the issue holistically, which maybe is different if you're a company just looking at that topic, right? You're just looking at deep sea mining, then you're interested to investigate that field in general. Well, we would look at minerals, and we will look at it, what minerals are needed, where are the different areas to get it, and not just deep sea minerals.
Yeah.
And that I think sometimes is, when I speak to people, that brings us in with a different perspective. Because we elevate the conversation one level up to look at minerals in general. And for instance, in Norway, deep sea mining and mining on land is in two different ministries. So they don't look at it together.
Yeah.
So it becomes very difficult to holistically assess where do we go and what should we do.
Deep sea mining conversation in Norway is sort of segmented from the mining conversation.
Yeah, totally.
Norway.
I think what's unique for me with Norway is that deep sea mining companies and the interest comes out of the areas of our bureaucracy in government and industry, which is oil and gas. Mm-hmm. This is where this springs out of. While maybe in other places, it's the mining companies. So it's like a very different group that you were talking to, which I think also is interesting when you, for instance, talk about when this argument that these minerals are needed for the green transition, which we don't agree with, comes then, for instance, an organization that works on oil and gas and deep sea mining. We are totally wanting to do everything to combat climate change and, for instance, limit the amount of new oil and gas exploration in Norway. And I find it interesting that those two areas of Norwegian industry is very closely linked. We have a ministry of trade, which has the minerals aspect. So they have circular economy on minerals and terrestrial mining. They also hold the minerals strategy. And under them is the Norwegian Geological Survey that's done like everything on minerals up to, well, quite recently. And you have the Directorate for Minerals. So we actually have an agency for minerals, which is a government body. But then deep sea mining was placed in the ministry that does oil and gas, with the oil and gas bureaucrat, and the agency, which was previously the agency for oil and gas, now the offshore agency. But it's very interesting when you look at the organizations for industry in Norway, for the law, when there's a public consultation on the Seabed Minerals Act, they very strongly in their public consultation comments say you cannot compare the oil and gas industry and deep sea mining industry because the technology is so different and we don't think that there's so much stuff you could bring in from one to the other. This is more closely related to the mining industry on land. From there to when the white paper comes, their comments completely change. And actually they say there's a lot of technology transfer opportunity. So that's actually a stark contrast from 2018 when they submitted very different
comments. That's interesting because, I mean, I came into this conversation much later than 2018.
Welcome.
And so I just heard this narrative of we have all this, Norway has all this experience with offshore resource development. And so this is going to transfer quite nicely to a new kind of offshore resource development. And it all fits together in this new offshore directorate. It's interesting hearing you talk about this. I am focused on the deep sea mining debate is values driven and how different people focus on different values, making their narratives and making their decisions and making their arguments, and how we kind of segment off into different goals, different values, and we don't always see the whole picture. And it's just interesting how that maps onto what you're talking about in the governance space, where each government agency has their own kind of remit, their own values, their own
mandate also, right?
Exactly.
And what they're asked to do.
And so the way that you scope where the governmental management comes from, which kind of organization it sits in, also kind of like frames the values or the...
And also just like your experience with that and how you understand the topic. So one of the things that was very interesting in the public consultation round on the impact assessment for this opening, which we probably will talk about more in Norway, was, for instance, that the Norwegian Geological Survey came in and said the way that the word resource is used in the impact assessment, like the word resource or reserve for a mineral, is a very specific financial term for something that is thoroughly mapped, that has specific criteria you have to be fulfilled to be able to call that a mineral reserve. Those criteria are not at all fulfilled for deep sea mining offshore at all. But in oil and gas, the way you talk about a reserve, it's very different. It does not come with the same terminology. So the Norwegian Offshore Directorate was using terminology that they knew from oil and gas and applying it into a mineral space where that terminology means something totally different, because there's been a set of criteria. Basically, there's a set of criteria for what you need to have mapped and described of that resource before you can call it something specific, to prevent that companies were misleading investors, right, of how much minerals were there. And I think when you're coming into then the mineral space, you need to be very mindful of what signals you're sending and what you as a government are saying that this is or this isn't.
Yeah.
And I think there was a very different use of terminology there that was also pointed out. And one of the things the Norwegian Geological Survey said was like the way you've extrapolated the data and the way you've mathematically modeled that is not aligned with what you can do on minerals. Like you cannot extrapolate like they are doing.
Yeah.
So they actually were strongly opposing the way that this was done in the impact assessment. And then from my hat on, then I'm like, why don't the government collaborate, like to make these bodies collaborate with their expertise? But this has not been what has been done. It becomes also extremely confusing for the public. And this resource assessment that Norway put out, which was like, I cannot even remember. It was like a huge number that they valued this resource at offshore, which was made from not a lot of data points for an area that's the size of Germany. So like that's very, very big. That resource assessment was not put out for public consultation, even though this was largely commented on in the impact assessment. And again, when you're in a new field, there's a lot of different ways to do this. I really do not understand why this does not go on public consultation. And I think it leads to a lot of confusion also in the public about, is it a resource, is it not? Like it's difficult to navigate if you're not an expert in minerals, which we cannot expect, the general Norwegian public to be. So I have a lot of these pet peeves about how that process was done in Norway that I don't think was an example of a good process to be able to get the best amount of information to then the politicians that are supposed to make a decision. Collaboration
is hard. I agree these terms, resource reserve, that was one of the things that I noticed first coming into this conversation is okay, we're comparing amounts of minerals using kind of different unit. Most people don't really think about this, but we have an abundance of minerals.
Having them in a way that means that you can actually get them out, to put it in very plain language, technologically, but also economically. And then, of course, for us, we also really highlight the environmental aspect of that. I don't know, I talked to a geologist who was like, it doesn't matter if you have like a bunch of minerals in a rock. It does not necessarily mean that they are glued together or in a way that you can in any way get them out. So just because you have a certain amount of rare earths, for instance, spread around in a huge amount of area, of course, when you add up 600,000 square kilometers of a little bit in every single rock, this becomes a big number. But that does not mean that that is actually in any way something that you can access. And when we have looked at the Norwegian deep sea area, at least, and we have had external consultations in to help us on this, because I am not a mineral geologist and I acknowledge that. They think almost none of this is actually economically feasible, able to get up, if at all possible, because I think also what a lot of people don't realize is oil and gas in Norway is extracted from the geological continental shelf. So the actual shallower continental shelf area, which is maybe between like 200 to 500 meters, maybe 1,000 if you're going really crazy. But that's very, very few of our wells that are, I don't know if there's actually any on the Norwegian continental shelf that are that deep.
Meters deep.
Meters. Yeah, sorry. When you're talking about deep sea, you're talking about 3,000 to 4,000 meters, or at least 2,000 meters. And there is no oil and gas drilling. There's no experience in this area in Norway. No one has been out there. No one has done that in oil and gas. So it's not the same. And then also oil and gas is fluid and usually under a lot of pressure. So if you hit it, it kind of easily able to get something up that's under pressure. While a mineral or rocks, basically, that you have to dig out of the ground. That's also sometimes easy to forget when we're talking about Norway and offshore activities and, what we have done. And the other thing is this is much further offshore. You cannot, for instance, have helicopter transfer out there at the moment without stopping over at, for instance, Jan Mayen or Svalbard. And it's much much, much further north. Almost the entire area is above the Arctic Circle. And I think at the closest, it's 30 kilometers away from Svalbard or Spitsbergen, which is supposed to be like heavily protected the nature there because all of the Arctic is under heavy pressure from climate change and pollution. For me, it's not so comparable to talk about Norway has experience on oil and gas, which we do. Like, I don't take away from that. And that to somehow say that that applies, that we would be able to do, like, that's not necessarily applicable one-to-one.
I'm excited to dig into the details of the Norwegian regulatory experience and the way it was presented and get all your thoughts on that. But first, I guess I want to just have you sum up what is WWF's position on deep sea mining, both globally and national to Norway.
So WWF supports a global moratorium or a precautionary pause, like a pause, which is not a permanent ban. So we don't support a full ban, but a temporary pause or thinking pause until a set of criteria are fulfilled. And those criteria include things such as having enough sufficient science to be able to assess the impacts, but also making sure that we adhere to making sure that the marine environment is effectively protected, which is also required under the United Nations Law of the Sea. It includes free, prior, informed consent from indigenous groups. It includes looking at the alternatives, so looking at the whole mineral pictures, including circular economy options. I just have to say, circular economy is not the same as just recycling. There's a lot of different things. It also is to make sure we have transparent and good processes to make sure that there is a well-informed public that partakes in that discussion, and also transforming the International Seabed Authority to make sure that this is actually a fully functioning body that also adheres to, the requirements they have, for instance, to do the 5-year review that is called. It's supposed to review itself every 5 years. It's been there for 30 years. It's done it once. And those criteria for us are needed to be in place before you can make a decision on deep sea mining. And that is the global position. And it is for exploitation. So mining, the actual mining.
How will it be determined that those criteria are in place? Like, especially we need to have sufficiently investigated circular economy. That sounds...
No, we need to have looked at the alternatives for the minerals. So the sufficient science is about the environmental science.
And so in that case, you're just kind of you're assessing the global scientific state of knowledge on these sorts of things.
On environment?
Yeah, on alternatives.
Yeah, so on alternatives, we did a report, we commissioned a report from SINTEF in 2022 to look at this, are these minerals needed for the green transition, and what are the circular economy possibilities that you could implement. And it was a super nerdy report. I would highly recommend it. We had people do material flow analysis, life cycle assessment, really get in there to really look at that. And it was based on the EAI scenarios.
IEA, yeah.
I always mix up this. For some reason, that acronym, I just have to say it a lot. And I always mix it up with EIA, which is Environmental Impact Assessment. I also say that a lot. And that report showcased a bunch of different scenarios, which wasn't sci-fi technology, but circular economy solutions that could be implemented. For instance, using a car battery when it can no longer be used for long-range transport because, it doesn't have the same amount of battery capabilities. You could use it maybe for energy storage, or designing products in a way that it's possible to change out the part that doesn't work anymore. Or, I don't know, a simple example for me, which of course I acknowledge this does not solve the mineral problem, but I think it's a good example for how policy can help us think smarter, is this new EU policy that says that every single small electronic thing you have need to be able to be charged with a USB-C charger. Yeah. So instead of having 20 different chargers, one for your smartwatch and one for your phone and nightmare, you can have one. And that limits that. So we want to look at those aspects. Yeah. We also look at responsible mining on land, because we recognize that some more mining is needed. And then you need to look at the possibility of that and holistically assess that. And that has been a lot of the work that we have done in the niche in deep sea mining, is trying to really look at that mineral need. And also, people say minerals, but minerals are a bunch of different things. It's not one-to-one the same. So when you, for instance, look at batteries and EV batteries, and I'm sure you've had people here speak about this on the podcast, but what minerals are needed there,
Yeah.
that's massively changing, right? You are looking at very different minerals and maybe not the minerals that are looked at in the deep sea. So looking also at changes in technology and which technology you pick up towards which minerals that you are needing.
Yeah, so you're saying that WWF does its own research. I mean, in this case, you funded external research in order to kind of answer this question that relates to the criteria on
So
the
this was,
moratorium.
and this gave like a bunch of scenarios, but for us, it's basically important that you look at all of the options and you're not just looking at deep sea mining separately from everything else, right? You're not looking at just the minerals there, but you look at it compared to the other sources. So that is how we approach that part of it. And when it comes to sufficient science, we really lean on independent scientific research.
Mhm.
And I think the best paper that came out there was this assessment of, the gaps that are needed when it comes to the ISA and the area. And that showed that it was 10 to 15 years before you had that science needed to be able to really effectively assess that in the international seabed area. So for us, then, that is peer-reviewed independent science that we would base our position also on when we talk to someone about how long would that be or what would that be. And then in Norway, WWF Norway's position has been a pause and a moratorium on all mineral activities, including exploration for the Norwegian deep sea area.
That's a significant distinction.
It's different. So that's important. But for the international, like the International Seabed Authority, the area position, this is about exploitation.
Yeah, cool. Let's you please walk me through the Norwegian developments in the regulation side of things. And at some point we'll get to why WWF thinks it's prudent to oppose exploration versus mining.
Norway has and got what's called the Seabed Minerals Act in 2018-2019. And at that point, it was not really a broad public conversation around deep sea mining. It kind of just, I think for many, popped up.
Mm-hmm.
And then this Seabed Minerals Act is quite different to many others. And I might just explain that now because I think it's useful to understand that to then understand WWF Norway's position. But the Seabed Minerals Act sets out, it's like a framework regulation, does not go into a lot of details. And it sets out, what is needed to be able to start deep sea mineral activities, which includes exploration and exploitation or mining. And before you can do any type of activity, either one of these, you need to do what's called an opening of that area. And this is something that is really prevalent in Norwegian offshore activities overall. It's the same for petroleum. It's the same for offshore aquaculture. It's the same for ocean wind. So an opening is basically a process where you do an impact assessment, a strategic overarching impact assessment, and then you may, in that process, do more research because you see there's more research gaps. So the Seabed Minerals Act says, if in the impact assessment you see that there is not enough knowledge, you could, for instance, commission more studies or, you could do something to gather that. When that impact assessment is done, you would present that and you would then also, based on that, make a decision. And it does not say that this has to go to Parliament, but the government or the King and Council, because the King is our head of state, can decide then to open an area.
Yeah, and this opening process is very connected to a specific geographical
so you have
space.
To point out, in that opening process, you would identify, this is the area I would like to assess for the possibility of opening. And through that process, you would perhaps select some part of that. And when I say you, I mean the government. This is something the government does. You would say, we suggest you open this area for mineral activities. And this is very important to understand because mineral activities in the Seabed Minerals Act is exploration and exploitation or mining. So it's not possible to open an area for only exploration. You have to open it for both. There is a way, of course, where you could change the Seabed Minerals Act and you could have an opening for exploration and then you could do a new strategic environmental impact assessment, so a broad impact assessment, and then a separate opening, which there were some members of Parliament that actually suggested when this was put into Parliament, but that is not the framework that has been decided on. So at the moment, that is the situation. And then an area, when it's opened, that doesn't mean that anything, that means that it's opened for the possibility to give licenses.
Right.
And then it's up to the government, right? And then what the government has indicated is the first license would be an exploitation license. not an exploration license. So there's two license types. There's an exploration license, but this is a non-exclusive license. So you don't get exclusive rights to what you find. And then there's an exploitation license, which has two phases, has first an exploration phase, and then you would submit what's called a plan of work, kind of similar, but for what you would do in the mining operation with a project-specific impact assessment, so just for your area. And then you could go forward with exploitation. And this is mirrored on the oil and gas. It's very similar to the oil and gas framework.
Okay, so instead of making the legislation specify exploration and then mining, they said there's going to be an opening process for activities. And then as the next application or the first application into that, once the area is open, the first application that a company would make in order to be granted the license to do some activity in an area is actually a mining license.
Yeah, so where I get lost a bit in the government's arguments is that they have said, and this is I'll present their perspective, that they want to open the area and give out licenses so that private companies can be a part of gathering exploration data that then can be used to assess, because it's so expensive to gather environmental and mineral data for this area. But there is no promise that mining will be allowed. But then when you read in the white paper, they say a sentence on page 70, if you're interested to read it yourself. It's not aktuelt or relevant to open this area for only exploration, as some is suggestion, because it is the view to profitable mining that makes it interesting for a company. There is a carrot there, it seems, right, for why a company would go in. That is mining, while at the same time they acknowledge that there is extremely little information. And the impact assessment that they did do, which first was for a scoping phase for a public consultation for this area they selected, which was 600,000 square kilometers. Mm-hmm. That is the size of Germany, or 1.8 times the entire land base of Norway. So they're trying to assess an area that is almost twice the size of the country that we live in under 2 years. So a very short amount of time. When it was out for the scoping phase, which is basically when they say, like, this is what we're going to do in the impact assessment, this is the timeline, this is the area we want to look at, these are the areas we want to investigate, there were a strong amount of comments from like every environmental body, including the Environment Agency, saying this area is way too big. We don't know almost anything about it. So, assessing 600,000 square kilometers is very challenging. Yeah. And they suggested that you would look at smaller areas. That's one of the suggestions. Like on ocean wind, for instance, they've made 20 smaller areas they looked at. Then they selected to go forward with 2 of those for such an opening process. Those 20 areas combined is a sixth of the opening area for deep sea mining. They went forward with the same plan. I think the Norwegian Environment Agency wrote it's impossible to actually fulfill the criteria of such an impact assessment if you go with this process. And they continued with that process anyway. So that's, I think, our first point of criticism is you got a lot of feedback in the point where you asked for public consultation feedback, and you did not integrate that and those environmental safeguards. And then when the final impact assessment was put out, it was very clear. I think the Institute of Marine Research said for 99% of the area, there was no environmental data. Common sense dictates it's then very difficult to do a good environmental impact assessment. Because of that, they had to make a number of assumptions, such as assuming that inactive vents, which is one of the type. Oh, that's also important. Norway does not have nodules. That's not the part you look at. It's the seamounts or the crusts and hydrothermal vents. So for inactive vents, they assumed that there was no unique fauna, no unique life, while they still stated that a number of studies showed that there actually was unique life there. So for me, this is contradicting. And at some point in the environmental baseline study they did, it says, due to kind of the large knowledge gaps, it is not reasonable. Doesn't make sense to do an holistic assessment of the environmental impacts. And then for me, I read that sentence and I'm like, this should then be a stop point in this assessment to see we clearly need more data. Like we do not have the data to be able to assess it. And instead, they made a number of assumptions. For instance, assuming that exploration activity would not have big impacts, They actually said small to no impact, while that assumption is based on that there is no unique fauna for these inactive systems. They, for instance, don't really clarify that drilling to be able to map out this area would be a part of that as an exploration, not exploitation, but exploration activity. They don't really specify what goes into exploration activities super clearly. So all of these different assumptions, which we would not say is on the conservative side, maybe for the environment, lead to an impact assessment that from our perspective does not fulfill the minimum criteria that such an assessment needs to have. Because you actually don't have information enough to be able to assess it properly. Or for instance, another assumption is a seamount, if you strip mine a part of it away, the actual crust, that this area could be recolonized from corals and sponges. And when we have talked to biologists, they say, actually, no, we don't think it's possible. And if it's possible, it would take like 50,000 years. And we don't know any of the species. So actually, we don't know if there is like a mineral component that they rely on. So it just seems to be based on a lot of things that are not aligned with the scientific evidence that the scientists that we speak to are saying. And this was also very clear in all the comments that came from that, from the Norwegian Environment Agency, which I have to say are the expert body on impact assessments in the government, but they did not conduct this one. It was the Norwegian Offshore Directorate and the Ministry of Energy, previously the Ministry of Oil and Gas and Energy, and Institute of Marine Research, several of the universities. And then there was also a huge amount of confusion at this stage where a lot of the entities said, it is unclear to us if you're talking about opening an area for exploration or opening an area for exploration and mining. And what is this decision actually based on?
Yeah.
And this was also a huge confusion in Parliament. Like, I talked to a lot of people that were like, but is it exploration or is it exploitation? And what is the opening decision based on? Because obviously, if there is a second strategic impact assessment on exploitation, then maybe you don't have to assess it on the exploration phase. And this was never really, from my perspective, made super clear. And there was a number of questions around it. And when you hear the political level in Norway talk about it, they talk about exploration, this is exploration, this is exploration. But again, the law and also the white paper itself does state that it is not just exploration.
Yeah. So yeah, this tracks fairly well with my understanding of the process and the controversy, which, there's multiple stages in process between starting a new industry from scratch. You kind of allocate an area, you create some processes for how we're going to get more information on the area, and then chunk off smaller areas and give people licenses to do more investigation and more work in these areas. So one of the things that I think I heard was that the reason why they bundled mining into exploration was because they wanted to give the companies who would be paying for the exploration some kind of assurance that they would have the rights to mine afterward. So I guess there's two things. One is just that the process was vague and didn't engender trust. And so a lot of people throughout the process have been like, I don't really know what you're saying until you're very clear that what you're saying is the kind of thing that we can agree to. Then we aren't going to approve your process because it's just not a clear process.
Yeah, or what many said, right, in their public consultations, and I think both Sintef and NTNU were examples of that, were saying, we understand this as exploration, or if this is just for exploration, we support this and that procedure. But that is not the case if it's also exploitation. And then those comments were maybe in some way still perceived positive or to the process. And
because it was
unclear, right?
Because
so
it was
you try
vague
to be
enough. If you heard it as, well, we're obviously just, I shouldn't use that tone of voice. Well, we're obviously just opening for exploration. Nobody thinks
for mapping, right? This is what many think.
Nobody thinks we're going to start mining.
Yeah.
I mean, for one thing, the companies aren't anywhere near ready. Like, kind of everybody agrees that we're not going to start mining, but especially that one sentence, which was on page
70 to 71, actually, it goes across 2 pages.
Where it says, well, we've got to grant for exploitation in addition to exploration. If anyone is going to put private funding into this, they need to have a carrot that they can kind of hold on to. That reasonably, to put that sentence in, it's like, well, if we're going to give someone a license, and you could do this in a very reasonable way, it seems to me, is to say, okay, here's a license for exploration, and as long as you do whatever is required under the exploration phase, then you are going to have exclusive rights to do the next phase if there comes a next phase. And that would be the kind of wording that you would think would be the kind of linchpin if you were to try to make this clear, because you wouldn't think that you would need to put the carrot out. Like in applying for an exploration permit, you're actually applying for a mining permit. Nobody would think that that is a necessary step or a reasonable step.
Yeah, but I think that is my issue with the carrot. Because if you're at some point is saying, no, it's only mapping. We have made 0 decisions on mining and that's for later and we'll assess the impact and we'll look at it. Then it's premature to give a carrot. It's premature to indicate to industry that they would have the right to mine that, right? Because you don't know. You have no idea. If you look at the ISA framework, for instance, you get an exploration license. You don't get an exploitation license. Those are very separate. For me, actually, when you talk about predictability for industry, this is extremely unpredictable if you are to trust what the government is saying, because they can at any point decide we're not going to do it. And then if you are saying that actually all you want to do is mapping, you could also change the law so that an exploration license is exclusive.
Yeah.
And my problem is that in the framework that is there now, the next impact assessment is a project-specific impact assessment, which is for that specific area. And if you at that specific area find 1 coral, 1 fish, and like this is not a realistic number of fish or coral you would find, but like some species there, and you have not done a strategic assessment of the larger area, again, you don't know if those things are unique to the place you are.
Yeah.
So it makes it incredibly difficult to do what also Norway has said that they will do, which is to assess the holistic impact. You will not just have one project, right? You would need to look at the cumulative impact of that industry starting up. And the framework as it sits today does not really allow for that. So if there was a second round of a strategic environmental assessment before you would move forward to exploitation, that's one thing, but that's not what I see. And the other thing is, I will say the area was reduced by about 50%, what they actually decided to open, but it was based purely on resources. So the mineral resources and not on any of the environmental aspects. And there is, in Norwegian management, we have something called particularly vulnerable and valuable areas, which are areas that are identified as like unique ecosystems or unique. It does not mean that no activity can happen there, but you need to be like extra cautious. And the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is one of those areas, which overlaps 1-to-1 with that opening area. So you would maybe think that maybe you would take that out, or you would take out the northernmost part that is 30 kilometers from Svalbard. But none of those areas were taken out. If I am going to look at this precautionary, stepwise way that the Norwegian government has said that they will go forward with it, I don't see a finger mark of the environmental part of that in any of the steps taken here. Because what I see is that the environmental authorities have on numerous occasions, they have said it in the scoping phase, they have said it when the impact assessment was out, and they also said it when the first licensing round was put on public consultation. This is too large. They do not have information. And now for the last one, I think they stated they don't have information to advise on which areas need to be avoided for also exploration activities. So they are actually not able to do their job. They're not able to do this management strategy that this stepwise approach requires because they just don't have the information that they need to have. And then in parallel with that, what we have seen through some of the mapping programs that Mariano, which is our kind of cross-mapping program in Norway, have said, they have, for instance, discovered a brand new coral ecosystem in that area that's unique in the world. Not just in Norway, but in the world. With a coral that we thought was solitary, so that it just like hung out by itself, basically. That in this area, actually, it makes a forest, which is a very unique ecosystem. So we also don't know what we don't know. And that makes it even more scary to start going down the path of allowing commercial activity in that area.
Yeah, so thinking about why this is so controversial in Norway, I see there has been so much scope for people to interpret it in the best way and say, well, yeah, they recognize that there isn't enough information, but it's got to be the companies that fund the next stage of information gathering. And so we've left the area big enough that the companies can like focus on where it's reasonable for them to focus. And of course, no one's going to go 30 kilometers away from Svalbard. And of course, there's going to be good mapping before the next phase.
But who will do that mapping?
Yeah, it leaves it open for people to say, WWF is being unreasonable in opposing this because there is a pathway through this legislation that can be taken reasonably. And then on the other hand, it's left so open and there's been so many indications of, okay, but you're not taking in environmental information at this stage. And so we're nervous. I mean, this goes back to the trusting. We're nervous that you're going to take it in at the next stage if we're going to like trust that everyone is going to do the best thing and do the next stage as well as possible. That's one thing. But the other thing that I think is new that I'm hearing from you is that because you need to do specific, like the next specific exploration stages in small areas, and those small areas, for one thing, need to be chosen specifically. Like if I'm a deep sea mining company in Norway and I have to go and choose my areas, I don't want to have to choose from this huge open zone areas that might end up being of particular environmental interest later. So like it seems reasonable that the government would have narrowed that down to, and then what you said about, plus what I'm doing as a company is investigating this one area, and it's not scoped for me to put that area into context of other areas. I'm not investigating this to see if it is the same ecosystem as other places. I mean, of course, we could somehow write that in, I suppose, that you need to find X number other ecosystems identical to yours before you can proceed to the next step. But that's not the way it's scoped. So that's just, I feel like that to me is new and helpful in understanding where the opposition comes from. It's like, you've got to scope this to the scale of the next process, and you're saying it wasn't done.
I give you an example maybe of a different way to do some kind of a strategic environmental assessment, which they did on ocean wind in Denmark, which is actually the government first mapped the area, and then out of that, gather like all of the data in. Then they were able to say, okay, this area was very important for nature, so we take that out. We don't even put it out. And then they decided to go forward with certain areas. And then when a company gets a license there, they buy the data from the government. But that data is then collected in a way, which means all the data is comparable. It's with the same technology. So also when you're building a model, like this is also very tech nerdy, but if you're building a geographic information system model, if you're trying to model where an ecosystem is or where something is, it's important that you have gathered the data with the same tools in the same way to make it comparable.
Right.
Like every data scientist would be able to talk about this. And of course, now with AI and different things, you can do some things with the data to maybe utilize data from different sources. But the best way is if it's gathered in the same way. Also that you have done it over several seasons so that you need to know when animals were there and when animals are not there. You cannot just go there one time and say like, I didn't see anything, so peace out. So that I think is one framework that is possible to look into. And I will also say that WWF Norway has been active since the law came, since before that in the public consultation, with actually comments about saying, we don't think this is a good process. This is maybe how you should do it differently. And we have had numerous conversations with the government, and we commissioned a bunch of reports, and we made all of that available to the government. So for instance, with the resource assessment, when we were critical to that and we think this was not done in the best way, we commissioned a report and we presented this to government. So it's not like we have not tried to have a dialogue and bring up our concerns. I think they were very well aware of all the concerns we were bringing up. My issue is I don't see that they are making an imprint into it. Yeah. And then you hear promises saying, you know, in also the parliamentary decision and also what's come out of the government, they say environment should weigh heavy in every phase of this new industry. And we're taking a precautionary approach. If you're taking a precautionary approach where environment is very important, why is the Norwegian Environment Agency not listened to? Like they are the expertise actually, and they were the ones that would be looking at the Pollution Control Act or any other acts around that. So like this usually from a regulatory framework is not a very good process because also the regulatory can change, the political landscape can change, actors can change. Yeah. And I think it's also important to note that, you know, when you're talking about deep sea mining companies in Norway, there's very few. And they're new companies, right? They're not companies that have operated here. There may be people there that have, you know, been around, but the company there does not have that experience. And the big offshore companies in Norway have not actually stated that they're interested here. Some of them have stated actually that the opposite. Yeah. Again, coming back to kind of our position on the moratorium and about transparency and having an informed public and making sure that people know what the decision is about, this aspect is also really lacking. Yeah. And I think it's important to me also to point out that is the government. That is the role or the responsibility of making sure that process is good. And it's been the government that we have criticized for that rushed process. And the way that the government has moved forward with this without taking the necessary safeguards and without also making sure there is sufficient time. And, like the European Parliament passed a resolution with like 530 votes against 30 against this Norwegian process. Yeah. And that, for me, is also very interesting when the main argument I'm hearing from politicians is we need to supply minerals to the EU. And I'm like, the EU, like the Commission has sent you a letter, the Parliament has passed this, they have been pretty clear. These are not the minerals that they are interested in. Yep. Actually, they are much more interested in land-based and circular solutions. It seems to be a process that says, how do we do this? And not, do we do this?
Yeah.
And at an SAA or a strategic environmental impact assessment, it should be a if we do it. Like, what are the pros and the cons and how do we weigh them?
Yeah, I mean, good clarification that it's really the government process that WWF is criticizing. I think that is good to be clear over, as opposed to criticizing the companies who are trying. In WWF,
and I've told the companies that, we are concerned with the governmental process. So far, it's just been the government that has done this process.
Yeah.
And then, of course, if you are an industry actor and you would tell me that, environmental aspects are really important for me and when I want to make sure that we are doing this right, then I would also question, okay, maybe you should also question that impact assessment. Because I do think it's correct, like you say, like if the government should make this a good process, they should take out maybe the most vulnerable areas for environment. And in the licenses that they proposed, it overlaps with like a bunch of active vent fields, which they have said that they wanted to protect.
A company trusts itself to not go and mine an active vent field, so the company wouldn't see that the government is not doing that part of their job as being such a problem. And I think all along have seen this criticism of the process as being unclear and lacking in foreseeability from all sides, and that they would have liked it to be done better.
They have not stated this in their public comments to the impact assessment, which, I see what they are saying, but I think it is useful jointly to point out when the process, I don't think it's a process that benefits any side of this process, because a bad process leads to bad results, and bad results lead also to very unpredictable situations.
Yeah, and I think that's a strategic lesson, certainly, is just because a government regulation has kind of been vague and leaving things in your control, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good for you, because...
And also there was like a number of questions, like there's a number of places in that process where big entities like NTNU or SINTEF are asking, what is it? Is it this or is it this? Or you could, the government replies to all the, they're supposed to at least reply to all the comment that comes on an impact assessment, where you could state, black and white, thank you for your comment. We'll clarify. It's for this, and that means that. And, for some of the comments, they have done this, but I think, again, if you're talking about starting a brand new industry that the government is pitching as like very profitable, which I would say our indications show that it would not be profitable, you would think that you would want to have an informed public debate. Maybe you would gather for like a public town hall meeting in different areas to have a discussion around that. While we did not really see that discussion was being elevated almost anywhere by the government, apart from, putting the public impact assessment on the internet for public consultation. But, general public is not maybe so often on the Ministry for Energy's website. I don't know. But there is, I think what we have seen is when we talk to people about that process, people are quite surprised and I would say shocked of how that process has been, both within Norway, but also externally, and are also not understanding like, what is the rush? Why does it need to go so fast? Yeah. Why can you not take more time as the government and doing it more properly? Yeah.
Okay, so then I want you to explain what has happened in the last few months and why.
So 2 years ago, the Norwegian government is a minority government. That's important to understand. They are now a government, but they require majority in parliament to pass their budget, their state budget.
And they're always a minority government?
No, they are not always a minority government. Sometimes they are a majority government. And then, of course, they're majority also, like they're the majority in parliament. So then they pass the budget that they present, because that is what, they don't have to negotiate it. But now they are a minority government. And they require partners to pass their budget, and they have specific partner like budget partners that they negotiate with. So 2 years ago, the Socialist Left Party put basically as a criteria, or through the budget negotiation with government, it was decided to postpone the first proposed licensing round for deep sea mining. So not the opening. The opening has happened.
Yeah.
And that was for 1 year, or to the end of the parliamentary period, because we have parliamentary elections, yes, like last year. So that was not really possible for them to postpone it maybe so much further than that. And then we had elections, and it was the same government that won, which is the Labour Party. And then there was a second, like a new budget negotiation, where they now relied on 4 partners. So very chaotic, one could say. Instead of having just one partner, now they need 4. And there it was decided that the first licensing round would be not to go forward with it until 2029. And that is now currently the standing in Norway. It's also important to know with Norwegian politics that we don't have snap elections. So the parliament that is in place is the parliament that is in place. We have set election dates. So there is no changes to that, basically. That's the parliamentary majority. So that this new parliamentary majority has then made a decision that they will not go forward with licenses until 2029.
So this has put a complete stop on the prospect of any companies doing any further exploration.
So what I think is interesting with that comment is that the companies have already been out on scientific cruises together with scientific institutions. And that's still possible. So it is possible to do research surveys in Norway through a resolution on scientific surveys. That comes with a set of criteria they have to do. It is not a license, but it is possibilities to do research. But there is no commercial licenses being given in Norway, basically.
Yeah, so they've withdrawn that carrot. They haven't said...
Well, it was never announced, right? Like it was never, the licensing round was never put forward.
Yeah,
it was just on consultation. So they have not gone forward with the licensing round.
They have not set those carrots on the table.
Yeah.
They haven't exactly said that no one is going to do exploration. People can still find ways to fund exploration.
But that's scientific. So I think that's also important to note, right? So you can get a scientific exploration license now. Not license, but like, yeah, a right to do scientific surveys, but you cannot get a commercial exploration license.
How do we navigate making trade-offs across value decisions in a deep sea mining context, in any context? This is a question that I have as part of my PhD research. So deep sea mining is often kind of framed as a trade-off between different value categories. We're trading off either environmental protection versus societal use of minerals, or we're trading off kind of current welfare opportunities against future risks, future welfare from these areas that if we don't exploit them now, we could exploit them later. So first of all, do you agree with this framing of the deep sea mining question as one between trade-offs of important value categories? The other question is, if so or if not, what are the value categories that you see are relevant to the deep sea mining discussion? And are there any that you think tend to be missing from the discussion, or any that kind of get smuggled in that you think are over-discussed but not so relevant?
That's a huge question.
It's a huge question. Very vague. I'm working on phrasing it better. I haven't gotten there after a year of doing this.
I guess that's why you have a PhD. You have lots of time to do a lot of diving into it. I think, the question around trade-offs, I think sometimes it's a bit misused in the deep sea mining debate. I very often hear, for instance, you have to trade the minerals you need for climate change mitigation against environmental protection. And I think sometimes some of these trade-offs are not actually correct. Or we don't really have enough knowledge to be able to say that it is a trade-off or it isn't.
Right.
So WWF's position, for instance, is these minerals are not needed for the green transition. And that's also the European Science Academy Advisory Council also stated very clearly, that argument is misleading, actually, when you look at the scientific basis. I do think what the issue is on deep sea mining, especially in Norway, is just a lack of knowledge overall. and also the presentation of assumptions as facts. So the assumptions, for instance, that there are no unique life in certain areas, leading to a lot of other assumptions, and then that end result being presented as a fact to the public, instead of, we really don't know, so here's an assumption that we throw out. And that leads to, I think, sometimes like artificial trade-off discussions. So what I think you need to do is you need to have facts. You need to base your decision on facts, and they need to be sufficient facts. They need to be facts about the environment. They need to be facts about also minerals and what minerals are needed and what minerals does Norway have on land and at sea, and the possibility to recycle or other circular economy strategies. But you also need to look at, for instance, the fact on fisheries impacts, which has not been sufficiently researched. That's, for instance, food safety, right? Can trace minerals go up into the value chain of the food that we're eating? We're a huge fishery nation. This is not really discussed hugely. And I think the societal impact area is interesting because very often that is equated to economic interests. Right. And that actually can be a number of other things. For instance, Norway's role in the world is very linked to, in a lot of multilateral frameworks, this great ocean nation that does sustainable management. And, we would question that for a number of reasons, like oil and gas exploitation. But deep sea mining has put a huge reputational risk on Norway. Our foreign minister called it the biggest reputational risk Norway had in April, right after the opening. Not on environment, just the biggest reputational risk to Parliament. So I think you also need to look at, when you have 40 countries calling for a moratorium or a pause, most of those are close allies to Norway. It's our neighbors in Sweden and in Finland, Denmark, Greenland, but it's also Germany, France, some of our biggest trade partners, the European Commission. Who you are in that world and how you navigate that question is also important for society and how Norway operates in the world and our role standing in the world. And also how you value science and scientific information and environment information in a world where maybe alternative facts and science is perhaps not valued in the same way that we are used to. And that part, I think for me, it's important as a Norwegian citizen that my government really presents facts as facts and also stand by the environmental obligations they have made, both nationally with the precautionary principle, but also, for instance, through the United Nations Law of the Sea, and that we don't start discarding those that they don't just become like pretty words that are said on a world stage, but they actually are something that we implement also at home. Because if the richest country on the planet cannot implement, environmental safeguards, and we are a democratic country, we have systems in place that would enable that. That's also sending a very dangerous signal out, I think, into the world. That you can kind of bulldoze over or discard that environmental advice if you're just very keen to do something.
Yeah.
That's not what I want to hear from my government as a Norwegian citizen.
Okay, that's a great answer to my very vague question. Two of the things that I heard in that was that in terms of the trade-off framing between these kind of abstract value categories, you're really stressing that in order to say that there's a trade-off, we need to understand how the things that we are doing are actually going to lead to end results. And if we don't have the information to make the causal link, then framing it as a trade-off question is hasty.
Yeah, like I don't know how many debates I've been in, which is called the deep sea dilemma. Yeah. Will we have climate minerals or will we have deep sea? Like that for me is like, that is a trade-off that is also very polarizing and that is presented and that is not based actually on what the science is telling us. Or like bodies like the European Science Advisory Council, which is like the independent body that gives scientific advice to the EU, is saying. And then that becomes for me like I don't know, you cannot choose to solve the climate crisis or the nature crisis. Like you actually have to solve them both because the ocean is like our biggest ally in the fight against climate change. So you're very reliant on those two interacting. And that's maybe an important point for me to make because sometimes I feel like when I speak to people, they're like, yeah, protecting nature. Like we'll do that if we have done like all of our other pieces first. Yeah. And we forget how foundational functioning ecosystems are to like our living ability on this planet without sounding like too dramatic. Like 3 out of 4 breaths that you take come from the ocean. It stores 30% of the carbon that we have emitted. And it provides fish, and it provides, it's done that for Norway for thousands and thousands of years. And without really a functioning ocean ecosystem, which we still are learning to understand, we are really in deep trouble. So we need to make sure that we do know that we are reliant on that. And then I think there's a lot of things we don't know about deep sea mining.
Yeah.
And the impacts.
Okay. You're also saying that the value categories themselves are much bigger than they're often kind of conceptualized as. Sometimes it's like, well, there's the environment and then there's society, but actually these things are very linked. And if you were to like pick apart what we mean by society, you would see that it's actually very connected to environment, and that creates kind of just like a structural problem for asking a trade-off question. The other thing that I heard you say was that in this sort of situation, it doesn't work so well to follow the chain of reasoning to the end and say this is the best, like to have a debate about a dilemma, choose a side and go for it. An alternative is to have a robust process. And when you're dealing with uncertainty, when you're dealing with pluralism of values, you need to have a trustworthy process. And sometimes the best thing we can do is go through the process properly. And so I heard you talk about how we need to ensure that people trust the process, that other countries trust Norway to do the process, that we are not only doing a process well, which we've talked a lot about that being in question, but we're seen to be doing a process well, that other people can trust the process.
And
maybe,
which we haven't touched on, and which I actually don't know how many are aware of that, but large parts of the area that Norway has opened for deep sea mining is not in the EEZ. It's not in Norway's exclusive economic zone. It's on the extended continental shelf. So an area of the ocean where Norway has exclusive rights to the minerals on the seabed, but the water above it is international waters. So in those waters, there are other nations with fisheries interests or with other interests. Or for instance, the new High Seas Treaty, BBNJ, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, that comes into effect there. So it's a very different jurisdictional area, which means also, for instance, counterparts like the EU or other nations that have fisheries activities there actually have a very different interest in those areas than in oil and gas, which is fully within our exclusive economic zone. And this is not something like when I hear a lot of people, like, again, one of my pet peeves when they're like, oh, Norway and their EEZ, I'm like, it's not much of that's in our EEZ. A lot of it is in the extended continental shelf.
That's a distinction that I'm aware that the EEZ generally goes to the limits of the continental shelf or to 200
yeah.
nautical miles.
Ballpark, yeah.
As
set by the United Nations Law of the Sea when you set and then you can do an applications process to establish your outer continental shelf.
So generally you get 200, I should know this, we've talked about it on this podcast before. Generally you get 200 nautical miles unless your continental shelf goes farther than that, in which case you get that. But what Norway has done is got an extension even beyond that to get this whole additional zone, but that is not considered EEZ.
No, it's the extended continental shelf. But you know where the geological shelf is this 200, 300, 400, 500, like then there's the continental slope, which drops down like the side of a mountain. And then there's this like deep sea area. And our extended continental shelf is into the deep sea area. So it's not a geological continental shelf, but it's an extended continental shelf. And there's a number of different like the continental slope and different margins and where you geologically point that out. And there is a continental shelf commission under the United Nations Law of the Sea where you can send in and say, okay, I've established my outer continental shelf here. And there's like a process of how you establish that. And all different countries have different claims to how they establish their outer continental shelf and waters. And Norway has a very large outer continental shelf because we have a very large coastline. But we have not had extractive activities on our outer continental shelf or extended continental shelves. And I'm not even sure if any country has had extractive activity on their extended continental shelf. And if you do have mining happening in this area, you are also required to pay a fee to the International Seabed Authority under Article 82.
News to me.
So these are also new legal complexities that makes also that entire opening process something where I think you should have had a broader and a longer process to make sure all the different parties that are, interested to learn more about this or might be affected by it is maybe involved in a better way as well.
And what you said earlier is that this whole extended continental shelf area that Norway has that kind of goes all the way up to Jan Mayen.
It's actually called the banana hole in English.
That area is called the banana hole?
That extended continental shelf area, which is a fun name. You
because
can look
I've
it on
just
a
been
map.
calling it the extended economic zone, thinking that explains the area, but I can switch to calling it the banana hole.
So part of it is in the exclusive economic zone, the EEZ, but part of it is in the banana hole.
And in that area, Norway doesn't have exclusive fishing rights.
Nope.
They don't have exclusive rights to anything happening on the water surface or the water column. It's just actually... And
they just have exclusive rights to the resources on the seabed.
So if I wanted to go and start an oyster farm out there, I could do that.
That depends whether or not that is explained as a resource. This actually has been, you joke, but there is a whole legal thing around whether or not a snow crab, for instance, is a benthic species that belongs on the seabed, or if it's like something that can swim a bit and therefore is in the water column. And that changes who has the right to fish it.
So is there anything else that we haven't covered that you would like to mention for anyone who's got more than an hour and a half of
so she's still enjoying this episode. So I think maybe the last part, we did not talk so much about the international aspect of WWF's work, which I think is also fine. I think you've had many people on the podcast talk about the ISA, but maybe just a point that I would like to point out about the international seabed, which I think is important to remind us of. And that is that this is the common heritage of all humankind, current and future generations, which puts a huge responsibility on decision makers and member states that actually what you allow today should benefit future generations. So not just those of us that are on the planet now, but also all of those going forward. And I think that's a perspective that we really have to respect in the convention and really have to reflect over how we best do that. And from WWF's perspective, that also means not rushing into decisions, because once you start, it will be very difficult to stop. So you need to be well informed. Otherwise I think it's, I could talk about deep sea mining for days.
Well, and okay, so you're heading to Jamaica in probably by the time this podcast comes to air, you'll be...
Probably. I'm leaving March 6th for 2 weeks.
And any expectations about what is going to happen there at this point in time?
Yeah, a lot probably, and probably a lot of things that is not always so predictable to know. We go there with quite a diverse delegation. I'm expecting that there will be a lot of conversations around how to engage at the moment. There has been some push from some actors that, the mining code or the regulations need to be finalized. Again, I think I would just stress WWF has no problem that the mining code is being negotiated. But for us, it's really important that, for instance, standards and thresholds and the science that you really need to inform those regulations are in place before they are finalized. So I think we are going to be bringing up the need to not rush also that process, ref our entire conversation now for an hour and a bit, that needs to be a good process. It needs to be based on science, and it needs to be based on also making sure that we fulfill those environmental obligations that the countries have in place. And then I'm expecting that I'll be talking to a lot of people, which I always do from all sides of the spectrum. But yeah, definitely think it will be an interesting meeting as always.
Wrap up questions. Where do you send people to get information on any of the things we've been talking about? I guess specifically, we've mentioned a few specific documents in Norway. If anybody wants to understand more about the Norwegian process, where do you think is a reasonable place to send them?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different options. We, of course, have a website, wwf.no, very easy. And I think maybe the best place to go is we had a webinar and we had a event in October last year where we tried to summarize with a lot of experts there, but from the economic sides, from the fisheries side, also the Sami Council were there, and scientists, what the Norwegian process is and where it was standing. This was before the licensing round was postponed. There's also the EU ambassador to Norway speaking there about the EU's perspective. Part of that is even in English for those that are, like the economics part is in English, for instance. So all of that is available on our website to watch or on YouTube. And then for WWF's work more general, we also have a WWF net website where if you look up WWF and deep sea mining, you would probably find it, where we have more of our reports. And, if you're interested in looking at the SINTEF report, for instance, the circular minerals it's called, or the other aspects there, then you would be finding those documents there. And then, people can always reach out to us as well. We are always try to answer questions.
Where do people follow you on social media? Are you active?
Oh, God. I'm like the worst on social media. Yeah, you can find me on Instagram. I have a bizarre name. It's Snublefota, which is like tripping foot in the region. It's just my mom's nickname for me. I'm not super active. Not going to call me, but yeah, you can follow me there. But if you're following me there to get deep sea mining information, this is probably not. It's mostly just dog videos. Yeah, so I probably would recommend following WWF Norway on social media then instead.
Okay, Kaja Lønn Fjærtoft, thank you so much for coming and explaining all this to me. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
To anyone who's still listening, thanks for sticking it out. And as usual, if you think this podcast is worth sharing, please share it. Give me a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform. The usual things that people say at the end of a podcast. And we'll talk next time.